What the research that's been collected together over the last 20 years shows is that attending to classroom formative assessment makes more difference to student achievement than anything else that we could do. But we need to be clear about what exactly formative assessment is. So slide 13 details what exactly we mean by formative assessment. To begin with, we start out with the idea of being clear about where the learner is going. What's the destination for this learning journey? Where is the student right now? And what does the student need to do to get there? That's pretty obvious. And thinking about the roles of different people in the classroom, the teachers, the peers, and the students, gives us a network of, or a matrix of 9 cells. And we could actually talk about what each of those cells is, but I think it makes sense to group these 9 cells into 5 what we call key strategies of formative assessment. So the first one is clarifying and sharing learning intentions, making sure the kids understand where they're going. This is in some senses the most obvious, and certainly in many districts and schools the most commonly implemented. So in many schools there's a rule that every single lesson has to begin with a learning objective, which is posted on the wall and copied by the students into their exercise books or notebooks, and then subsequently ignored for the rest of the lesson. But if a leader walks past, you're covered, there is a learning objective on the wall. Now, I'm not saying that in general kids should know that kids knowing where they are is a bad thing. What I am saying is that doing this all the time with a narrow objective is actually counterproductive. Sometimes you don't know where the kids are going. Of course, if I'm getting kids to balance chemical equations, I want every kid doing it the same way as I do. But if I'm getting kids to react to a poem by D.H. Lawrence, it's fine if kids take it in different directions. Some kids will take it off in one direction, other kids will take it off in a different direction. That's fine. I don't have a single goal. I have a whole horizon of goals for the class. So sometimes you can't be precise. Sometimes it's not smart. Sometimes telling kids where they're going spoils the journey. For example, in math, I might be using some problems where the key realization is that triangles with the same base and the same height have the same area. But if I tell kids that we're doing problems involving the area of a triangle, then I've completely spoiled the activity, because now I've made a problem into an exercise. So sometimes it spoils the journey. And thirdly, sometimes it just gets boring if every single lesson starts off with an objective. And we've done interviews with students and they say it's just really boring. So sometimes they say, can't we start off with a question or an activity? So what I'm talking about here is variety. Of course, children should in general know what the aim of the lesson is, but sometimes the best way to do that is to stop a discussion halfway through the lesson and say, where do you think this is going? The other thing about teachers' lesson planning is that usually the lesson objectives are rather too precise. Shirley Clark gives the following example. The class is working on an objective to understand the impact of sugar production on sugar producers. And of course they work on this and they do very well on the test at the end of the topic because they've been focusing exclusively on sugar production and sugar producers. What Shirley Clark points out is that a better intention would have been to understand the impact of production on producers, and to understand that the context of the learning is sugar production, but the success criterion is, can you apply this knowledge to a different context, like banana production? The really important thing is that students should be able to take knowledge away from one context and apply it in another. The second strategy is about eliciting evidence. It's not just questioning, it's all the ways we find out where students are in their learning. So it's engineering effective discussions, activities and tasks that elicit evidence of students' achievement. It's not just questioning. PE teachers might ask kids to do a forward roll or a pike or a tuck on the trampoline. It's about all the ways you find out where kids are in their learning. And even in academic subjects, asking a question can sometimes close down the dialogue. A history teacher might be dealing with the causes of the First World War, and you might ask the students which country was to blame. And what you've just done then is to invite a kind of guessing contest where kids will plump for Russia, Serbia, France, Germany, Britain, Austro-Hungary. And the reason that it doesn't work very well is because kids think that just choosing one of those countries is enough work. If instead you make a statement like, Russia was most to blame for the epic of World War I, what do you think? What's interesting is that kids know that just agreeing or disagreeing with that statement isn't enough work, so they feel obliged to give their reasons for it. And when you make statements rather than asking questions, students respond more thoughtfully, often with sentences rather than single words, and with more developed ideas. So it's all the ways we find out where kids are in their learning. The third strategy is providing feedback that moves learning forward. Back in 1998, Paul Black and I said that schools ought to give feedback in the form of comments rather than grades. And many teachers did that to their credit. Unfortunately, a lot of the comments that kids got weren't very good. They were just a list of all the things that were wrong with the last piece of work that they're never going to get to do again. This wasn't a very good piece of work because you didn't do this and this and this and this, and you didn't, so it's not a good piece of work. And that's the end of the story because the kid doesn't get a chance to repeat. So feedback needs to be focused not looking backwards at the kid's previous work, but actually looking forwards. Yes, of course, he needs to refer backwards because that's what you know they can do, but you need to use that to say what's next in that student's learning, which is why we call it providing feedback that moves learning forward. This distinction between backward-looking and forward-looking feedback was perhaps best summarized by Douglas Reeves, who said it's the difference between getting a medical and a post-mortem. And the trouble is that most of our kids get too many post-mortems. The last two strategies actually place the student at the center of the process. As Rick Stiggins points out, the most important decisions taken in classrooms are not made by teachers, they're taken by students. No matter how good the feedback is, if the student doesn't want to take any notice of the feedback, it's going to be wasted. So the last two strategies are activating students as learning resources for one another and activating students as owners of their own learning. And these two put the student at the center of the process. Now, too often, particularly in high-stakes settings, we think we can do the learning for the learner. Who creates learning? It's not teachers. Only learners create learning. And yet in many classrooms I walk into, the teachers are working very hard and the students not so much. Somebody once joked, schools are places where children go to watch teachers work. And I say to teachers, if your kids are going home less tired at the end of the day than you, then the division of labour in your classroom requires some adjustment. I don't mind the teacher being tired, provided the students are exhausted. So at one extreme, you have the teachers who try to do the learning for the learner. At the other extreme, you have the teachers who use the F word, facilitate. They don't teach. I don't teach, they say. I just facilitate learning. To which I say, why are we paying you? You're just hanging around waiting for some learning to happen. Teaching is complex because you can't resort to either of those two extremes. You can't do the learning for the learner, but you have to do more than just put the knowledge in front of kids. And that's why I sometimes describe teaching as engineering effective learning. It's about creating those situations in which students are learning. And sometimes you need to be telling them what to do, and sometimes you need to be getting out of the way, taking a back seat, getting them to work on their own, or getting peers to help them. These 5 key strategies between them seem to us to create a very cohesive framework for effective classroom practice. There is a research base for each one on its own, but together they seem to be very, very coherent. They're not original in any way. Each of these 5 key strategies brings in a whole range of other practices, as slide 14 makes clear. So, for example, many teachers have explored de Bono's thinking hats, and that's a very powerful technique for getting kids to think metacognitively, to think about their thinking. But it's just one special case. So these aren't new ideas, but these 5 key strategies of formative assessment do appear to be a way of helping teachers think about and reflect on their practice. The big idea here is that we use evidence about learning to adapt what happens in classrooms to better meet student needs. It's an incredibly simple idea. It's just very difficult to do it in practice. I sometimes joke that I'm glad that pilots of airplanes are not teachers. If our planes were piloted by teachers, I know how they would navigate. They would set out from London for Singapore with a planned flying time of 12.5 hours, and then after about 12 hours begin to look for a landing strip. And they'd set down the nearest one and say, "Is this Singapore?" And the ground crew say, "No, it's Jakarta." But then the pilot says, "Everybody get off, I've got another job to go on to." Because that's what teachers tend to do, isn't it? As teachers, we tend to teach kids stuff, and right at the very end of the teaching, we give them a test. And if they've learned it, we say, "Great, well done." And if they haven't learned it, we say, "Too bad, but we're up to chapter 7 tomorrow because we've got an exam coming up and we have to cover the syllabus. So all I'm suggesting is that as teachers, we should do what our pilots do all the time, which is to think of the educational task as we do in slide 16 here. A good teacher establishes where students are in their learning. Where are we starting out from? Identifies the learning destination. Where are we going? Plans the route to get there. Begins the learning journey, and then makes, during that learning journey, as a result of the readings, make adjustments to the course as conditions dictate. An incredibly simple metaphor, a very difficult thing to do in practice. Here are some practical techniques for doing this in classrooms. So for each of these 5 strategies, we have something like 20 or 25 techniques. And obviously I don't have time to go through them all, but here are some really practical ideas on slide 18. So for example, sharing learning intentions. Well, the idea here is that before students do a piece of work, you get them to understand quality by looking at somebody else's work. One of the mistakes we make is to give kids ways of evaluating their own work before we get them to look at other people's work. Self-assessment is harder than peer assessment because it's too emotionally charged. Finding mistakes in other people's work is much easier than finding mistakes in your own work. So one of the things that's really powerful to get kids started with perceptions of quality is to, for example, take some work from last year's class, whether you're talking about a ghost story or a lab report, and you take them, suitably anonymized of course, and give kids 3 or 4 of these things to look at different levels of quality, and ask them, what's good about the good ones? What's missing about the ones that are not so good? And very quickly, what you'll find is that students see mistakes or weaknesses in other people's work, and they'll say to themselves, I must make sure not to make that mistake in my own work. And when we see kids having started on this process of looking at quality in other people's work, they are far less likely to make the same mistakes in their own. So sharing exemplars is a way to get started. Eliciting evidence. Finding out where kids are. I mean, most teachers use questioning, but you only hear from 1 or 2 kids. So a much better response is to use a mini whiteboard, for example. I saw a lovely example in an advanced mathematics classroom. A teacher asked the kids to sketch the graph of y equals 1 over 1 plus x squared, and the students did that on their dry erase boards. She held the kids held up their responses. The teacher eyeballed the whole class's responses and saw that they all understood. So what did she do? She just moved straight on. Now, that's what she'd been planning to do all along, but now she knew it was the right thing to do because she had collected high-quality evidence that showed that moving on was the right thing to do. Providing feedback. One of the things that Paul Black and I have been saying for many years now is that feedback should be in the form of comments rather than grades. But it's still quite hard to get kids to read the comments. One teacher that I did some work with in London, Charlotte Kerrigan, tried something different. She's an English teacher, and she's been giving kids comments rather than grades for many years, but she still wasn't happy with the amount of attention the kids were giving to these comments. So she tried a new idea. The kids had done an essay on Shakespeare, and rather than writing her comments on the notebooks where the kids had done the essays, she wrote them on strips of paper. And each group of 4 students got back the 4 essays and the 4 strips of paper, and their task was match the comments to the essays. Students owning their own learning. This is a technique that I've seen used very effectively in an advanced mathematics classroom. So every kid has a set of 3 coloured cups nested in one inside the other, green, yellow and red. And at the beginning of the lesson, the green cup is showing. If the student thinks the lesson is going a bit fast and they'd like the teacher to slow down, they show the yellow cup. And if they want to stop and ask a question, they show the red cup. Of course, why would anyone show red and say that they want to ask a question? Well, in this classroom, the rule is as soon as one kid shows the red cup, the teacher picks another student at random, and whoever is chosen has to come to the front of the class to answer the question being posed by the kid who showed red. This teacher describes what she's doing as converting her classroom into one gigantic game of chicken. And her current problem is the kids are stopping the lesson all the time. They're saying, I don't get it, miss. Isn't that a great problem to have? Another use of the coloured cups when kids are doing individual seat work. Green, I'm okay. Yellow, I have a question, but it's not stopping me from working. Red, I'm stuck. I can't make any more progress until somebody comes to help me. And just using these very simple techniques, teachers have been able to triage their time in classrooms and make much more efficient use of the time they have available. And finally, students as learning resources for one another, a pre-flight checklist. So, for example, science teachers often have a long list of things that they require to be in place on lab reports. You know, there must be a title, there must be underlined, there must be a margin. And the idea is that there's a checklist of all these things, and before I can hand in my work, I have to get my buddy to check my checklist. So they have to sign off that I've done all the things that are on the checklist. And so I show my work to my buddy, and he signs off and checks that I've done all these things. And once he says that they're okay, I can turn this assignment in. Now, if there's anything on the checklist that isn't right, then it's my buddy that gets in trouble, not me, because he let me down. It's about helping kids help each other improve their work. That's 5 of these techniques. We have a list of over 100 of these techniques. The danger is that we actually flit from one to the other, trying each of these techniques without getting any detail, any kind of solid, really entrenched practice in any of them. And so in the final session, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how you can support your colleagues and how your colleagues can support you in putting this into practice in your own classrooms. Thank you.